Minister Paschal Donohoe TD, Swaha Patinaik, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us all from. My name is Ciarán Madden. I'm the Consul General of Ireland here in New York. And on behalf of the Consulate and our partners in the European American Chamber of Commerce, we want to welcome you to today's discussion with Ireland's Minister for Finance and the President of the Eurogroup, Paschal Donohoe TD. My tie is a none too subtle reminder that this meeting is taking place in the context of St. Patrick's Day, but the flag behind me, I suppose, is also a reminder that while Ireland has great standing and status in the United States and great reach, we must at all times remember that we are also European as well as Irish. A couple of housekeeping points. You will hear next from Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild, the Executive Director of the European American Chamber of Commerce in New York. She will be followed by the Minister in conversation with Swaha Patinaik, Global Economics Editor at Reuters, Breaking Views. The Minister will make some brief opening remarks and then take questions both from Swaha and from all of you. While there will be time at the end of the discussion to take questions from the floor, I understand that Swaha will also aim to weave your questions through her conversation with the Minister. So please submit questions early and often. I should mention the event is being recorded. By way of introduction of Minister Donohoe, I want to make two brief points. Firstly, in the context of today's discussion, which will no doubt touch on transatlantic and matters and even more global matters, the Minister is an internationalist. He has served previously as Ireland's Minister for European Affairs, and both as Minister for Finance and as Ireland's Minister for Public Expenditure. He has been both a leader and full-throated supporter of the Global Ireland Plan to expand Ireland's global reach and footprint. This is not just about opening more embassies and consulates, which has been part of it, but it's also about scaling up Ireland's infrastructure and capacity to promote trade and investment and extending the reach of Irish culture and the reach of Irish business. It's a recognition that Ireland, as a small country, always needs to look outwards, and that we do so with purpose. My second point is really just an extension of that. In July of last year, Minister Donohoe was elected President of the Eurogroup by his peers. That election took place just a few weeks after Ireland was elected for a 2-year term to the UN Security Council. In his statement after the election, Minister Donohoe said, and I quote, his priority would be, to chart a common way forward on building the European recovery. And he noted that across the EU, our citizens are looking to us to provide the necessary leadership. The reason I linked the Minister's election with the UN election is that for the Minister as head of the Eurogroup, as for Ireland at the United Nations, the election was the start of something rather than the end of something. It is about taking our responsibilities in the world at a very challenging time. And it is a challenge I know the Minister relishes. In the more immediate term, his first challenge will be taking questions from all of you. And before you hear from the Minister and Swaha, I will hand you over to the Executive Director of the European American Chamber of Commerce in New York, Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. Thank you.
Unmute. Thank you, Ciarán. The EACC in New York and the Irish Consulate have a very close relationship, and we are very honored to have Minister Donohoe today with us for this important discussion. I just said in the green room, it's very important to showcase what is happening in the EU and to make sure that our American friends understand what we're doing and how they can get involved in our activities, investment opportunities, etc. And it's also important to showcase that so that we can learn from one another. Any good conversation requires not only a superb subject, but also a skilled moderator. And we are delighted to have with us Swaha Patinaik of Reuters Breaking Views. Swaha is based in London and writes about global financial market, macroeconomics, and policymaking. She previously was posted to Paris as a Reuters senior economic correspondent and to Brussels as the European Economic and Monetary Affairs correspondent. Swaha, I would like to hand over to you to start the conversation with the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and welcome to this discussion. I would like to first kick off with the Minister and some brief thoughts he had to get our session open.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good day to all of you. It's great to have the opportunity to participate in this event. I think it's very typical when we begin these events in a digital way. We all reminisce and reflect on how nice it would be together to be able to do this physically. And of course, if there was any location in the world in which I would rather be doing this physically, of course, it would be with all of you in New York in the run-up to St. Patrick's Day. The main sign that I can offer to all of you that St. Patrick's Day is approaching in these strange times is not only am I wearing a green tie this afternoon, I'm actually wearing a green tie with rather subtle shamrocks on it. And it's the only point in the year in which I can wear a tie like this and it's accepted and it's seen as a sign of good taste. So as I said, Swaha, it would be lovely to be able to do something like this later on in the year at such a point in which our health allows us to be able to do it. As you indeed said yourself, I only want to make some brief opening points because the value of exchanges and formats like this is my doing my best to answer your questions and hear your views. So I'll just say a word about the relationship between Ireland, Europe and America, a word about where the European economy stands at the moment, and then a word about Ireland. So if I open up by saying a word about the relationship between Europe and America, I simply believe that it is the most important political and economic relationship in the world. It accounts for nearly 60% of the global income of our world. But I think even more important than that economic performance is the fact that it is based on a shared heritage of values, of history, of culture, and of friendship. And it is, of course, a relationship that, as all relationships do, went through some change in recent years, but it is a change that I'm enormously optimistic about for the future. And I think when the European Union and America work in tandem with each other, and when we align our policies on top of aligned values and a shared outlook on the world, there's so much that we are capable of achieving together. And of course, an important weave in that overall relationship is the relationship between Ireland and the United States of America. There are around 30 million people living in the United States of America that identify themselves as Irish. In more normal times, I would spend a lot of my time traveling backwards and forwards between the United States and Ireland, building on what is and trying to contribute to what is a really, really important relationship. If the relations of culture and family are very strong, and I touched on a moment ago just how strong they are by how many people there are in America who see themselves as being Irish, it has a very modern and a very economic component that has been built up on a shared focus on trade and on American companies either doing business in Ireland or using Ireland as a foundation and a launch pad upon which they will do business with other parts of the world. A couple of figures to illustrate that. It probably won't come as a surprise to you that American companies in Ireland employ 180,000 people in my own country here, but Irish companies in America now employ 110,000 American citizens and people working in America. And it is a relationship that increasingly, I think, is flowing more evenly in both directions, where we have seen so many Irish companies, particularly in the aftermath of the last financial crisis, use America now as a market in which they're doing more and more business in, investing more in, and employing more people in. That leads me then to what will be happening, of course, next week. The Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, would normally be visiting America. Unfortunately, he can't do it on this occasion to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, but he's very much looking forward to meeting President Biden virtually on Wednesday. And I'm looking forward to engaging with some members of President Biden's administration myself on Wednesday too. Secondly, if I say a word about where Europe stands at the moment, many of you will be familiar no doubt, with all of the figures in relation to the performance of the euro area and Europe in battling with this dreadful pandemic. And indeed, the economic outlook was just updated by my colleagues in the European Central Bank a few hours ago, where they indicated their view regarding how the euro area and the EU will grow across 2021 and 2022. Two key points that I'd like to emphasize to all of you in the debate that I'm sure we'll have soon is the kind of change that's happened in the European Union in dealing with the consequences of COVID upon our economy. The change that is encapsulated in the launch of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is a fund of loans, of grants of over 650 billion euro that has been funded by a common and single debt that will be issued by the European Commission on behalf of the European Union. This is the kind of policy that even 18 months ago would have been unthinkable. But its development, its agreement, and then its implementation is a sign of the constant change that is the project of the European Union, and change that was accelerated to ensure that our citizens within the European Union don't face a heightened level of risk as we see this pandemic do such harm to our political project and to our citizens. And of course, we're well aware of the challenges that could be posed by growing macroeconomic divergences inside a shared currency zone. So that's a sign of the kind of action the European Union has taken in dealing with the pandemic and its effect on our citizens. And finally, just to say a word then about Ireland. Ireland, of course, from a policy point of view, like many other democracies in developed economies, has had to take huge actions to help us deal with COVID-19. However, we've really strong foundations to ensure that we're able to recover from this. We have a very, very diverse economy. We had very well managed public finances going into this crisis. We had regained our credit worthiness. We had a very well regulated banking sector. And all of this means that while the challenge that we are facing is great, I'm really confident that we're going to rise to that challenge and we're going to overcome it. A sign of what we can do is the fact that despite everything, gross domestic product in Ireland actually grew last year. And while there are always some influences in those figures generated by the scale of international investment that we have here in Ireland, on the other hand, it does point to a very diverse economy. And I know when we're successful in the coming months in continuing to suppress this disease and make in particular our vulnerable citizens healthy, that will lay the foundations not just for an economic rebound, but for an economic recovery. And to end where I began, an essential element in all of that will be our relationship with the United States of America. And I want to pick up with what Kieran said a moment ago. I'm an Irish citizen, I am a European. Both of those concepts enrich each other, they complement each other culturally and politically, but they're also at the heart of how I believe my own country and Europe will be able to recover. And I look forward, as we do that, to an even stronger and more positive relationship with the US in the years to come. So Swaha, on that note, I will conclude and look forward to your questions and that of the audience.
Great, Minister, thank you very much for those introductory remarks. Let me, given especially the audience and all that you've been talking about, pick up on perhaps one area of contrast. I think policymakers like yourself in Europe have been trying very, very hard to help the economy through a difficult period. What we're seeing, however, just as we saw after the global financial crisis, is that the US is going even harder at the job of stimulus. I think in Janet Yellen's face is going big. And we're talking 2 trillion nearly passed this week and something of a similar magnitude on infrastructure. Eurozone economy will emerge later, quite a bit later than the US economy to its return to its pre-pandemic levels. What do you think? You've done a lot. What else do you think you could do to build on it, to accelerate this recovery and help that growth that you're talking about?
Yeah, thanks very much, Swaha. I think I think the context of that question also needs to be recognizing some of the broader differences between the economic and social architecture of the European Union and that of the United States of America. And I'm making that point just to compare and contrast to what the two countries have, with what the US and the EU have done. And to make that point that inside many of the measures, some of the measures that are included in President Biden's first stimulus package, it does include a number of things that happen in Europe due to the different social insurance and welfare systems that we have. So, for example, in the stimulus plan of President Biden, there are many measures in there that focus on income protection and income growth that have already happened in Europe because of the very different social insurance systems that we have and the different welfare policies that we have, which are implemented in a more automatic way than can sometimes be the case in other parts of the world. That being said, one of the issues that the European Union and the Euro area is always looking at is making sure that the measures that we have in place are proportionate to dealing with this economic huge challenge that we are now facing. The Recovery and Resilience Fund is going to be implemented. That is a fund of just over 650 billion euro. Euro area member states have already taken discretionary budget choices of around 4% of the euro area income. And what you've seen in the last few weeks is you've seen the European Commission issue an economic communique acknowledging now that additional budget flexibility is going to be needed across 2022 and encouraging member states to continue to take a very supportive stance on budgetary policy in 2021. We're going to be having a meeting of the Eurogroup on Monday, and we're going to be working to reach further political agreement in relation to how we will do that. And I think, Swaha, what you will see is in combination with the rollout of the central initiative from the European Union, which is the Recovery and Resilience Fund, you will see more national governments take decisions to continue support for their economies as we move through this crisis. So I think the way in which we will deal with it will be different, in that not only will we have a central initiative coming from the EU, you'll see continued action from individual member states to complement that central initiative to ensure that we continue to have a response of scale. So that's the way in which I think we'll be approaching it, and we'll be working hard to drive the performance of the euro area. Like very broadly though, of course, it's to the benefit of all of us that we're all looking to drive economic performance in our different parts of the world. What we are doing, I hope, will help the United States of America, and what the United States are doing, conversely, will help the European Union and the euro area.
Let me pick up on the point you were making about the additional budget flexibility. So for those in the audience who aren't Brussels fans, it's called the EU Stability and Growth Pact, and those are the budget rules by which all EU member states are expected to abide. As you mentioned, a very sensible decision was taken to just suspend them for the time being in the face of this shock. In the spirit of, however, of never wasting a good crisis, the Europe is also looking at revamping the Stability Pact and the budget rules. It was called, the Budget Pact was called stupid by a former European Commission president, and during my time in Brussels in 2002, Romano Prodi. Lots of efforts have been made to make it more clever, and it's not always necessarily worked out as expected. What do you think we should do to make this a really strong pact for the future, both on focusing on investment and on enforcement?
Well, the first thing is I think we do have to take care regarding where we put our political energy at the moment. We are in the middle of, as you well know, Swaha, we are in the middle of an economic crisis. We have to work so hard to get our people, our citizens back to work. And I think we should be opening up the debate on fiscal rules and their future when we are in an atmosphere of having made more progress, both economically and from a public health point of view. And what we have really done is we have focused on what is the right budget policy for the European Union, and in particular for the euro area, while that fiscal rule flexibility is there, which the Commission have given a preliminary indication of will continue to be available across next year. So I'd separate it a little bit. We have to focus in on what's the right budget policy to respond back to your first question, and then we schedule the right discussion on fiscal rules at the right time. In relation to what those rules would look like, and I have to be clear at this point, I'm speaking as Minister for Finance for Ireland and not President of the Eurogroup, because there's many different views in relation to it. I think it's likely you'll see a kind of focus on a number of different areas. The first one is, what can we do to recognise that change needs to happen for a green transition, and to put in place the kind of investments that are absolutely vital to reduce the use of carbon. And I suspect this will be a theme in the discussions that will happen about the fiscal rules. I think the second area of focus will be on their clarity. They are, as you know, extraordinarily complicated, and that complexity has been generated by at times an effort to find flexibility and to recognize that so many economies can face different issues at different points. But we have paid a high price for that in complexity. And not many people will have their spirits roused or their hearts raised by concepts like the output gap. And we do need to have a think about that in the discussion that we'll have. And then the third element will be how we really do more to try to encourage what we do really mean by counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy, and how we can do more to encourage that when times are good or better, that we are putting in place the right signalling to lead to sensible management of national finances. And I can't prejudge what will be the outcome of those three areas, but my judgment is that much of the debate will be located around those three themes.
Perhaps I should ask you, with the House of Finance Minister of Ireland as opposed to Eurogroup President, you talked about technical concepts like the output gap, but one way of allowing higher levels of growth and not worrying about inflation is actually to raise the potential growth rate of an economy. And that can be done with spending on investment, productive investment. Do you think these sort of spending on investment should be excluded when one is looking at deficits, debt, and trying to keep people in line with the EU budget rules, given the positives that come from such spending?
So I think that is definitely one of the debates that will develop. Of course, one of the difficulties with all of this is always how do you define exactly what investment is and make sure that all countries have a consistent definition of that investment. And Swaha, given your role in Brussels and how much time you did spend covering these topics, you know the debates that break out regarding what is the definition of capital. For example, should capital include human capital? And how do you define what investment is? However, I think there are two things that have changed the background to the debate that you will have seen when you were living in Brussels and covering off those kind of topics. The first one is the heightened need for investment to deal with our transition towards a far lower climate future, because the investment needs that are there are so significant. The framework of the future can only have the level of credibility that it will need if it has a sensible answer to how do we encourage the investment for that kind of change in the future. And then the second point that has changed is, we do need to recognize that we went into this current crisis where levels of private capital investment, as well as levels of public capital investment, had not really caught up on where we were in the aftermath of the 08 to 11 crisis. So investment in capital and in capital formation never really recovered to where it had been before the last crisis across many of our members within the European Union. And that has such a profound effect on citizens, on their lives, on issues such as housing, issues such as education, not to mention the issue I mentioned a moment ago of climate. So the background to that debate and that particular issue has now changed. And I think that will influence the debate and the negotiation on that issue as well.
Okay. Let me, since we're talking about long-term and investment, bring in a question from the audience. Eric Moore is still asking about Project 2040, which is one of Ireland's top strategic investments, and is wondering what is the current status of this project? Is it on track?
Yes, it is on track. Project Ireland 2040 is our long-term view in relation to how we want to invest in our own country. That is on track. It's all funded. The main issue that we are having with it at the moment is because of COVID-19. We have had our construction sector closed for longer than we would have hoped. And the key issue that we are now facing is how we can have that sector up and running again and able to work on those projects. So the issue for that plan at the moment is not really funding. The issue at the moment is how we can actually deliver it due to the closure of our economy.
Perfect. We are going to be taking more questions from you shortly. So do post them in and they'll be sent through to us shortly. So do start posting in more questions. While we're waiting for some more to come through there, Minister, let me ask you, on both sides of the Atlantic, governments have taken on huge amounts of debt to help their populations get through, keep businesses that were viable, on life support, if you like, while they've been in lockdown. Are you at all concerned about, is 100% of GDP the old, the new 60% of GDP, which is the Maastricht sort of debt levels? Do you think the world can sustain higher debt just generally for a longer period, even if, as we're seeing, a rise in bond yields is starting to creep through?
Thank you, Swaha. And just to say to our technical friends, I'm having a little difficulty in hearing you. So the sound is going backwards and forwards, but I still caught nearly all of your question. So while I'm answering it, I hope your sound can be strengthened a little bit. So, so to maybe make a counterfactual point, for those who would be, very concerned about the higher levels of debt that have been incurred due to policy choices that are being made by governments at the moment, I'm not sure that the absence of those policy choices would lead to more improved debt metrics, because the absence of those policy choices would also have a significant economic effect that also would affect the debt measurements that we look at so carefully. So if I look here at Ireland and give a very practical example of it, our indebtedness will increase by between 8 and 11 points as a percentage of our national income. Around 1/3 of that is all of the employment and income support schemes that we have put in place. If I cancelled all of those schemes, the effect of that would just be to lead to an increase in unemployment. And then the social welfare commitments that I would have to meet the needs of those who are unemployed would cause the debt metrics to deteriorate anyway, and in fact would heighten the harm to our employer fabric within our country. So that's just to make the point that the absence of some of these policy choices does not automatically lead to an improvement in the traditional debt sustainability measurements. In relation to how much debt we can bear, I do believe the additional debt that has been incurred at the moment can be and will be managed by the developed economies of the world, primarily because of how it has been financed, the interest rates it has been funded, and primarily because I do believe by putting in place the measures that we have, we will be able to rebuild the growth rates of our economies back towards their trend growth rates, which will over time, I believe, ensure that the interest rate bill that we are facing on these higher level of debts will be affordable. But I am aware of the big policy debate around this. I'm one of these really kind of potentially sad politicians that comes home at night and reads books about politics and economics. And to give you a truly dejected image of me, I got home last night after a busy day and read an essay by Jason Furman in the current edition of Foreign Affairs, where he was making the case again, as he has with Larry Summers, that we need to be looking at measures of debt in terms of how we measure flows and not stocks. So that debate is going to unfold and is unfolding and may well affect the choices that we make in the future. But the one thing I am certain of is that if you are on a path to reducing your deficit and borrowing requirements at a time in which it is seen to be safe to be doing so, it ultimately does make that debt more affordable as well. And that's particularly the case for a small economy like Ireland. So look, I hope I haven't put you off by me reading Foreign Affairs and Jason Furman late at night after a busy day of politics. But I am really aware of the kind of debates in relation to this, and it's very relevant to the work that we have to do as finance ministers.
Speaking as somebody who reads Charles Goodhart and Manoj Pradhan's sort of a tome on inflation and whether we're due for a reversal, I'm not casting any stones, Minister. Let me ask you a question from Porrick Garvey, which stays on the economics theme. Porrick's asking, the Eurozone runs a current account surplus on the balance of payments, a sign of an excess of savings over investment. To what extent are there policy ambitions to increase the levels of investment and improve the Eurozone growth dynamic, vis-a-vis the US, for example?
That's a really good question. And I mean, this does tie, that is the other side of the coin, which I mentioned a moment ago, which is how levels of public and private capital formation in the Euro area didn't pick up in the way they might have been expected to pick up in the aftermath of our last crisis. So to answer his question regarding what we will look to do differently, or try to do differently in dealing with this crisis, one of the things the Commission have done is that the Recovery and Resilience Fund, they are looking for that investment to be used for investment purposes, particularly in the green and digital areas. So we can increase our investment in our future and indeed in trade with friends and partners like the United States. But more specifically, what they have done is they have also looked to use this as an opportunity to try to encourage the reforms and changes within our own economies that will over time lead to higher levels of private sector investment as well. And I'm really conscious of this as a policy challenge for us, because I see the issue of how we have the right levels of investment and the consequences of not having the right level of investment as having really serious social and political consequences, not to mention economic risks. And as we get ready to recover from this challenge, it is an issue that is uppermost on our minds at the moment here in Europe.
Great. We have a couple of other questions. I'm not going to take two on Brexit and Northern Ireland together. First one from Jerry Crotty, who's asking what your current views on the Brexit impact, the impact that Brexit will have on Ireland in the longer term.
So, so if you look at it from an economic point of view, you know, we've always been very clear that the impact of Brexit on our economy in any scenario is one that is negative. it's going to affect the growth rate of our economy across the medium term. However, we have looked to drive change within our economy to ensure that the potential hit is not as big as it could have been. And we are seeing many signs now within our economy, for example, with regard to financial services, that have shown that our country has seen further strengthening of sectors like that in the aftermath of Brexit. So that is a positive sign amidst a difficult scenario. On that scenario, however, like, I'm really optimistic that our economy will evolve and will strengthen even despite Brexit. Our economy is so diverse, it has so many different drivers of growth. And we've already been through one hell of a crisis a decade ago that we got through. That has really given competitive rigor to our economy that will help us in dealing with the consequences of Brexit. It is the political issues that are really challenging for us. Our friends, our neighbours, our partners in Northern Ireland, how Brexit affects them, the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which you and some of your guests may have read a lot about in recent years, how we can ensure that we have an agreement with regards to Northern Ireland that respects the fact that Brexit has happened, but also doesn't change the Irish relationship with the single market in Europe. And the Northern Ireland Protocol is one now we're working very hard to implement. But as you know, Swaha, the early weeks and months of it being implemented have been tough. But we're very committed to it in Ireland and within Europe. And we're now engaging with our colleagues and in the United Kingdom to see how it can be implemented in a way that might deal with some of the difficulties that are developing. But as you know, this is a difficult area. There's the potential now for legal action on this from the European Union, showing how difficult it has become. But as with anything in politics, we just have to keep at this and work our way through it because the stakes are high.
Absolutely. On a related note, and your hardest questions are coming from the audience, perhaps.
Yours are pretty hard now, Swaha. So I'm a bit concerned about what is to come. My sound might have to go a bit.
Ronan Dunn is asking that if indeed we can separate politics from economics, and that's not always clear, how do we support the economic well-being of Northern Ireland as good neighbours and partners in the economic well-being of the island of Ireland?
Well, you can't separate politics and economics. And economics is political economy, and politics is heavily influenced by economics. You can't isolate them. You can't separate the study of them. And you certainly can't disaggregate them within democracies. So that is why the question is so kind of well-founded then about our neighbours in Northern Ireland. Two thoughts on it. The first thought is that the Northern Ireland Protocol and the implementation of it does, I believe, genuinely offer opportunities to businesses that are located in Northern Ireland, because of the relationship that it offers them for how they will trade with Ireland and how they will trade with the single market. So there are real opportunities there for businesses in Northern Ireland that could avail of that. Secondly, we have a commitment here in Ireland to what's called, in this government, what's called the Shared Island concept. And this is all about how we want to invest in concepts and in projects that we believe will not only economically benefit Ireland, but will also benefit our neighbours and friends in Northern Ireland. And there are so many infrastructure projects that, to use that terrible cliche, genuinely could lift many boats on both sides of the border. And we're really, really committed to doing that, and are hoping to progress that initiative with the Northern Ireland Executive and Prime Minister Johnson's government across the coming while. And then finally, of course, the other way in which we can do it is continuing to have a commitment to an economy that supports and focuses on north-south trade flows, as well as east-west trade flows as well. And again, there are still so many opportunities for trade and for cooperation with businesses in the north, here in Ireland, that are still there despite the political issues that Ronan has touched on there. So there is a lot of work to do, but we're really committed to doing that work and trying to make it happen for the benefit of the all-Ireland economy.
Let me ask you a question. It's not been posted here, but I know a lot of people I spoke to when I was talking about what would be most interesting to hear from you, what they were interested in was taxation. And you spoke at the beginning about Ireland looking outwards, and as a result has attracted a lot of multinationals to its shores. You also recently spoke with some optimism about the possibility of maybe reaching an agreement by summer on digital taxation, digital corporations taxation. I mean, given the importance of these multinationals to Ireland's economy and the tax revenue you get, how would such a deal affect what you look at in terms of budget planning and the economy?
It certainly would have an impact. And I've also recognized in my public statements that there are many different options in relation to digital taxation that could have an effect on our tax revenue. But on the other hand, we have now a very broad tax base within our country. For example, during this time of COVID, we've actually seen our income tax revenue even grow, reflecting the fact that we now have a very, very, very broad personal tax structure here in Ireland. And that means that we would approach a challenge like that as we were to plan for it over a number of years in a way that would be safe and in a way that would be able to respond back to such a development. So yes, there are many outcomes in relation to digital tax and the change in digital tax that would affect our revenues. However, there are two buts. The first but is that within the OECD, if agreement is reached in the OECD, it does offer the really, really important benefit of ensuring that an issue in relation to tax does not become an issue in relation to trade. And that really matters for us as a country that is interwoven so much into the trade between the EU and the US. The second benefit that an OECD agreement brings is it brings the benefit of stability. Stability in relation to tax architecture and stability in relation to future tax policy. And again, if you're a small open economy, that's a big benefit as well. So that's why I've spoken about the OECD in a net terms in a positive way, because while acknowledging that it would pose a revenue challenge for our country, I'm also very clear that at least if an agreement is reached there, it also offers benefits to us that in the medium term will be important.
Perfect. I have dozens more questions for you, Minister, both from myself and some from the audience, but time is running out. So let me try and wind the discussion up. And I'm going to pose an invidious question to you. Politicians around the world have had to make decisions that affect lives, actually whether people live or die. In the last year, I don't think any of us would have liked to take those decisions about whether we do lockdowns, don't do lockdowns, vaccines and such things. But in that spirit, can I ask you for one thing that you think at European and Irish level was a really good decision, and one with perfect hindsight, which don't we all wish we had it at the beginning of this, that you think could have been done better?
So that is a very good question. And I will... so if I think about it from a European perspective, the development of the Recovery and Resilience Fund is a signature response back from the European Union to the challenges of COVID-19. And that combined with the decisions that finance ministers took between April and May, I do believe laid the foundations for a very strong economic response. What we could have done differently is in the early phases of COVID hitting Europe, we did have real challenges in relation to the sourcing of equipment and in relation to the management of travel, medical equipment, I should say, and PPE and in relation to the management of travel between member states of the European Union, that, you know, while it was happening at a time of crisis, also had consequences that I do wish we could have avoided, and did lead to a tone and scenes developing across that phase of the crisis, that if we had it all over again, and I hope we never have it all over again, I think we'd work hard to avoid some of those things happening. So they'd be my European examples of it. And then from an Irish point of view, some of the schemes that we put in place to support employment, I think was a really, really positive development that we can learn from the future in terms of what we could do differently. Decisions in relation to opening up our economy, we got some of those decisions right. In retrospect, and if we ever end up in this situation again, there are other decisions that we can make differently. What all these things have in common, though, Swaha, is none of them have been easy. And the atmosphere of uncertainty and the atmosphere of risk has been really, really demanding. And all of us have been tested. And we need to use a realization of what we could have done differently, not to trap us into being unwilling to make decisions, but to fuel our determination to try to make decisions of the future in a better way.
Thank you very much for the thoughtful response. I think your frankness has been very appreciated by the audience from the comments I'm seeing. But let me hand back to wind up to Kieran over in New York.
So thank you. It only falls to me just to say thank you to the Minister. I know the questions could have gone on for another hour. Among the topics that were coming up on the screen there were US and European diversity and reduced European immigration to the US, planning for future pandemics, the Irish consulate in Miami being sold to you as a good winter destination by one of the participants, and prompting consumer spending. So a lot more to discuss, but thank you for taking the time. I know you came to us straight from a call with the President of the European Commission, the European Council, and Christine Lagarde. So we're very grateful that you took the time for a really excellent discussion. And thank you, Swaha, for making it an excellent discussion. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And Minister, I might leave the last word to you, if that works for you.
I gave an interview today in which I professed my admiration for the music of Beyonce. And I was worried that this article might have spread all the way over to America and given me given some pointed questions in this session. So I'm glad I've managed to avoid that now. And look, I just want to conclude by thanking Swaha for all of her questions to me. Normally when I'm thanked for my candidness by a journalist, it's probably a sign now that I've got myself into difficulty. So we'll see what the day brings, but I'm delighted to have participated in it. And I just want to thank Yvonne for the event, and also thank you, Kieran, for all the work that you are doing at what is a very, very difficult time. So I know the challenges are pretty big at the moment, and they have been going on for a lot longer than we would have hoped. But we are going to get through this, and we will all get to a better place, both from an economic point of view, and most importantly, from a health point of view. And I look forward to, when we do it, having an opportunity to do some of this in person. And it's a reminder of what a small world it is. When I look at some of the messages that are coming in from guests of yours in America, I actually know some of the people putting the questions in. So it's a reminder to me of the links that we do have, and how good it will be able to kindle them together again. So in advance of next Wednesday, I hope those of you who are going to celebrate St. Patrick's Day still find a way of doing it, while complying with the public health guidance in the area in which you're living in, it should be said. But do have a good day if you can. And Kieran, thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Minister.